Speaking with reporters following his trip to Asia, President Obama reflecting on the first half of his presidency while offering a preview of what he thinks comes next. And in our fourth story, while the president hints at Obama 2.0, we gain new insight into the struggles and victories of the original flavor. A result of a White House divided, revivalists versus survivalists, in a team of rivals without very much team. The man reporting from the front lines, Richard Wolff, joins me in a moment. Mr. Obama once again shouldering the blame for his administration's perceived failures, this time pointing to his, quote, obsessive focus on policy for neglecting things that matter a lot to people, hinting that in the next 2 years he will not be as legislatively focused, instead comprised of more outreach to the public and, yes, more calls for bipartisanship. Quote, my expectation when I sit down with Mitch McConnell and John Boehner this week, along with the Democratic leaders, is that there are a set of things that need to get done during the lame duck, and they are not going to want to just obstruct what they're going to want to engage constructively. Good times. Great oldies. Joining me now, as promised, MSNBC political analyst, author of the new book, Revival, The Struggle for Survival Inside the Obama White House, Richard Wolff. Good evening, Richard.
Good evening, Keith.
The reason that you did this was to discover what, if anything, had changed the entire Obama team inside the West Wing during this first 20-plus months. What was the answer, and was it a surprise to you?
Well, it was a surprise. It surprised me that such a relatively simple question would be out there unresolved for so long. And in fact, that it had begun before the campaign was even over. I tell the story about how John Podesta, the former Clinton chief of staff who was running the transition, gets into a heated exchange with the campaign people before Election Day saying, you know this promise you made about not having lobbyists in the administration? Well, we got to get around that. Now, the campaign people said this wasn't a minor thing. You know, this is what the candidate, the president-elect, really believes in. And, of course, they watered it down one way or another. Podesta says, well, he was really just hedging where the president wanted to hedge. But that debate about whether you should stick to the revivalist spirit of the campaign or govern and mold yourself to Washington, that has been the fault line running through this White House for the last 2 years.
All right, if it's Obama loyalists, revivalists, Valerie Jarrett, that crowd, the veterans who've been with him from the beginning, versus the old-hand Clintonists, the survivalists, if the president had repeatedly rejected this Clinton model for his presidency, why were there any survivalists? And in fact, why were they seemingly in charge?
Right. Well, that's a great question. And in fact, by the way, there were some Obama loyalists who are on the survivalist side as well. So it's not just a pure Obama-Clinton divide here, but that framework from the primaries really does set up what happens after. Remember, in the final stretch in Iowa, he goes up and gives a speech crystallizing the debate between the two, where he says, you cannot at once say you're the master of the broken system in Washington and offer yourself up as the person to change it. My argument is, based on my research, my sources, he's got a foot in both camps. He wanted to try and do both, and it was just as untenable for him in year one and year two as it was for Clinton in the primaries.
Is this why we have gotten this bipartisan needle stuck in the same record at the end of the record for the last 2 years? Even now, the president talking about the next 2 years, he's going to try to be more bipartisan. Is there some connection between this overarching view he has of himself as the president of everybody who didn't vote for me, that it sometimes seems to eclipse the idea that he's also the president of people who voted for him?
Well, there is a self-image there, you're right. This is the guy who said he would unite red and blue America, so he's going to try and do that. There is also a late dawning belief, a realization among these people that, in fact, there were no reasonable Republicans out there, that this Republican Party no longer had a Bob Dole figure, and that the other side, while they were trying to govern, had carried on campaigning. And that was a really simple mistake that many of the campaign people said, hey, guys, the other side hasn't stopped the election. It took them a long time to realize that.
And you write that the Scott Brown victory in Massachusetts in January was the real wake-up call that knocked the president out of his complacency. But what changed? And if something did change, why 10 months later is there still this attitude that we saw during the run up to the midterms, and even now this kind of que sera, sera?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Scott Brown happened. Everyone said this president's dead. He's finished. Health care is dead. 2 months later, he gets health care. So there's a repeated pattern here of people writing this guy off, saying he's finished. There was New Hampshire. There was Texas and Ohio. There was Pennsylvania. This guy was supposed to have been done a long time ago, and he bounces back. So that's number one to keep in mind. Of course, you don't know. He's always going to bounce back, but there's a repeated pattern there. Secondly, they have come to understand that you've got to reach out to independents. They're the people they've lost. But in fact, can you get Republicans? They're under no illusions now. So they come into this a little more realistic, and they also come into it knowing that how much damage they have suffered by going into this governing Washington mode when really the country, left and right, still wants reform.
The lead survivalist announced for mayor of Chicago on Saturday, formally out of the picture. Does that change the picture for the next 2 years, or does the change in control of the House neuter any effect that might have towards what a lot of people thought this White House is going to look like?
Well, it does change in the sense that there are people close to the president who realize that instead of Emmanuel sort of adapting to the ways of the campaign, he, in their own words, sought to undermine it. Now, there's an argument to be made that actually this is exactly the time you want a Rahm Emanuel. You want someone who can lock horns and be the partisan figure, and maybe early on was not the time you wanted him. But hindsight is a perfect thing, of course.
Richard Wolff, the new book is called Revival, and we're very grateful that you came here to talk about it first. So now that when we introduce you each time on the show, it'll be Richard Wolff, the author of Revival.
And I'm going to try and trip you up with that, but thank you.
That's all right. It's Revival. It's a good word. Great, thanks. Good to see you.
Thank you, Keith.